How does Austrian economics contribute to the field of business strategy? In a very big, very distinctive, and highly practical way, we're about to take a guided tour of the breakout features of Austrian business strategy.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We are here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. Strategy is a product of business schools. In fact, its origins lie in the military, which explains why you hear expressions like the battle for market share and competitive warfare. Austrians have better ways of thinking. In fact, we don't think about strategy and competitive positioning and those kinds of business school subjects at all. First and foremost, we think about value generation, enabling valuable experiences for customers. That means we think differently about the role of the firm. We think differently about markets and industries. In reality, we don't think about them at all because there's no such entity as a market and there are no boundaries that can define an industry. There's just value. So we think about capital and resources in a value generation context. Their value is determined purely by customers. And we think about structure and organization from the customer backwards to the firm. All of this means we have a totally different and distinctive approach to what business schools call strategy. We're going to describe that approach today in some detail. Our guide is Dr. Matthew McCaffrey. Matt teaches at the University of Manchester in England, and his economics doctorate is from the prestigious Université d'Angers, and his master's degree is from Auburn here in the US. He teaches business and entrepreneurship and how firms succeed, and his research activities cover a broad span of businesses, including, very interestingly, to mention just one where Matt is a subject matter expert, video games, where a great deal of innovative thinking about value, creativity, user communities, and decentralized organization takes place. We'll get a flavor of that and a lot more today. Matt, welcome again to the Economics for Business podcast.
Hi, Hunter. Thanks again for having me.
Well, it's an exciting episode that we're going to undertake here. We're constructing a systematic application of Austrian economics to business to show how businesses perform better when the people running them or working in them utilize Austrian principles and tools. And you've been a prodigious contributor to the project. I'm going to mention 3 recent publications, and we'll link to them on the key takeaways. There's a co-authored book with Peter Klein and Nikolai Voss, Austrian Perspectives on Entrepreneurship, Strategy, and Organization. And 2 papers that you shared with us, Rules as an Organizational Framework for Emergent Strategy Process, which is you and Voss again, and also Carmen Dorabat. And Firm Strategy, Integrating Resources, Capabilities, and Judgment Through an Austrian Framework. And you co-authored that one with Ulrich Moller, who's from LEMEX, the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Unit at Bremen University. So we've got a lot of scholars working in this area of application of Austrian principles to business. The papers are in kind of academic language, and we're going to cross the bridge into business language today and unleash their insights. So that's our plan today. And here's where we're going to start. You say that entrepreneurship and business come together in the firm. Every firm's an entrepreneurial endeavor, and firms are established, maintained, and transformed by entrepreneurship. So let's start there, Matt, and tell us why you stated that.
Sure. So one of the core facts that we have to deal with in economics and likewise in entrepreneurship and thinking about the firm is that the factors of production, land, labor, capital, etc., they don't come together spontaneously on their own. Somebody has to organize them at some point. And of course, we know that organizing them and creating useful combinations of land, labor, capital, and so forth, we also know that this takes time, which also means that our decisions might not work out the way we planned in the future. So in addition to just figuring out how to use the factors of production in general, someone also has to take responsibility for bearing all of that uncertainty that's involved in using those resources. And that's essentially where the business firm begins, because what a firm in an economic sense and a business sense is just an entrepreneur or entrepreneurs and the assets that they own and control. Right? So those two things together, entrepreneurs and some kind of alienable assets that they control, those together are really what business firms are. And so in this perspective, at least, we have a very close connection between entrepreneurship and the firm, right? In a sense, we could say that all firms require some type of entrepreneurial effort in order to be formed to begin with, but then, of course, also to be run over time and to evolve over time, and to develop, for instance, a strategy, which we'll talk about a little bit, I suppose, as we go along.
Mm-hmm. And that's a big application of the Austrian theory of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship takes place at the firm level. It could be a firm of any size. The firm's a vehicle for implementing entrepreneurial action, from owning and assembling the means of production all the way to implementing marketing and selling and execution. So let's go there. The firm is a vehicle for entrepreneurial action.
That's correct. As always, when we think about this, we have to remember what the end goal is. And of course, the end goal is always bringing a good or a service to market and satisfying some consumer or group of consumers. In other words, creating value for people. So that's always the end state. And it's always useful to have that in the back of our minds when we think about all of the steps that are required to get there, because it's really, in a sense, that's the ultimate goal of this whole process, right? Is to bring something to market and to make somebody a little better off because of it, right? So when we talk about entrepreneurial actions as a way to get there, what we're usually talking about are investment decisions and choices about how exactly to combine the different factors of production. And of course, the goal of this is always to create some kind of stream of valuable goods and services that are eventually going to make it to consumers. Right? And once more, there are two sort of universal conditions of these decisions. And one of those is the need for some kind of decision-making authority, because somebody has to figure out how we're going to assemble these resources, put them together, and ultimately create a product out of it. So somebody needs to do that, namely the entrepreneur. And in addition, there's a second condition, which is that somebody needs to bear the uncertainty that's going to be involved in this production process. And once again, this is going to be the entrepreneur. Right? So these two conditions of action, we could call them, the need for some kind of decision-making authority and the need to bear uncertainty. These are sort of like two intertwined threads that run all through the business firm, whether it's a large firm or a small one. Essentially, all firms require this decision-making ability and this ability to bear the uncertainty of the future. Right? So these are general conditions of essentially all firms, and so they're always have to be very thoroughly integrated into any kind of discussion we have about how business firms work in practice.
Well, when you unpack or drill down into that entrepreneurial function, Matt, of producing for exchange, you get to the decision making about the best resources to utilize in the production process. We call it the assembly of resources, but it's the entrepreneur putting together the firm, the machines and the people and the office buildings and the software code and so on like that. Why is it so hard to get the decisions about the best combination of resources to get it right? Why is it so hard to do that? Your colleagues and yourself have even developed theories about the resource-based view of the firm. Combinations of resources are hard. Why is that?
Well, as you observe, every business is going to require some kind of resources. They could be tangible, they could be intangible. But no matter what they are, they have to be fit together, almost like puzzle pieces in a way. But the problem is that if we want to stick with this puzzle metaphor, we could say that we have thousands upon thousands, maybe millions of different puzzle pieces, and we have to fit them all together in just the right way in order to make the overall puzzle emerge. But the problem is, if you, again, sticking with this metaphor, that not only the individual puzzle pieces, but also the larger picture that they make are constantly changing. Right? So, just as a way of using this metaphor to grasp the sheer complexity of this process and how many things have to go right. Because when you're, again, whether you're dealing with tangible or intangible resources, they don't all work equally well at all tasks. Most of them are specific in some way, and they can't just be instantly and costlessly repurposed to do something else, right? You can't just make, you can't just transform an industrial dishwasher into, a computer server or something like that. These things have very specific characteristics that make them more or less useful in different, when you put them to different purposes. So one of the things that entrepreneurs do, and of course is a tremendously difficult task, is to try and figure out how to make all of these different pieces work together. And then how to make them work through time. In other words, how to figure them out right now such that they'll still be valuable in the future. And then also how to deal with all kinds of other changes that might be going on in the external business environment as well, because the state of technology is constantly changing, consumer wants are constantly changing, and so forth. And how entrepreneurs put these different resources together is ultimately going to have a profound impact on how successful they are and how able they are to satisfy consumers and to generate some kind of profit. But one of these fundamental questions that they have to address first is exactly how they're going to do this. And as I say, it's very difficult to arrange this because resources are so heterogeneous, as the Austrians like to say, because they have different degrees or different amounts of specificity, to use Ludwig and Lachmann's term.
Yeah, the word heterogeneous always is a hard one to get your head around, but I think you give us a good illustration that you can't turn an industrial dishwasher into a server. That's a good picture. I get that. So we have a tool in Austrian economics, Matt, that helps businesses to make this calculation, to figure out the best combination of resources or assets. And you helped us with it last time you were here, but we may go through that again. You talked about capital is the value of those future consumer experiences that the entrepreneur is trying to create, flowing back in time to the capital structure. And you also used in your paper this vision of value flowing backwards. And then entrepreneurs capitalize that flow, that future value experience. It's still a little tricky to get your head around, I think. So distill for us the key points of Austrian capital theory as they pertain to business management. How can business managers capture that idea?
Sure. Well, let me mention some of the, let's call it the greatest hits of Austrian capital theory, some of those major points. The first one you indicated was the idea of capital as a kind of flow that is a flow of value, usually value expressed in monetary terms. So the idea here is that all of these resources that entrepreneurs are putting together, of course, they're designed ultimately to create some type of good or service that's going to be sold to somebody, hopefully to make them better off. Right? So when we talk about capital, what we're talking about are the long series of let's just call them rents that are going to be being paid to these different resources as a result of successful entrepreneurial action. We want these rents that are going to be coming through us over time. Of course, we want them to be positive, and we're looking at this whole long stream of value that we're creating over hopefully long into the future, and we're trying to sum it all up and discount it back to the present. And typically, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about capital. In other words, capital is going to have a lot of similarities to things like discounted cash flow and so forth, and other concepts that will be very familiar to anybody who does business. So again, when we talk about capital as a flow, we're talking about this persistent ability of entrepreneurs to satisfy consumer needs going into the future, and we're talking about adding up all of that value expressed in monetary terms and discounting it back to the present, right? And so this ultimately involves a lot of other sort of Austrian ideas as well, including things like value imputation. And so you mentioned the notion of value flowing backwards, so to speak. And so that's also an implication of this, because obviously the value, even though we talk about entrepreneurs as sort of creating value, ultimately it's consumers who determine the value of the consumer goods that they buy and consume, and also all the factors of production and all the resources that go into creating those goods. So this leads to the familiar Austrian idea of imputation, the idea that value flows backwards in this way, and that ultimately entrepreneurs are going to be beholden to consumers' values as they do their work, because entrepreneurs can't independently influence the value of their own products, of course. That ultimately is going to be up to the consumers in the marketplace, whoever they might be. So this is a really crucial idea in Austrian value theory in general, but also for Austrian capital theory, because it shows very clearly that all of the resources that we might put into a business, they're not valuable in and of themselves, and they're not valuable because of their objective characteristics. They're valuable because consumers value the goods that they produce. Right? They're valuable essentially because through a very long chain of production, hopefully at the end, there are going to be consumers who say, yes, this is something that I want, that benefits me, and that I'm going to be willing to pay for. And then their valuations of those consumer goods extend backwards through time until we account eventually for basically all of the factors of production, all the land, the labor, the capital in the entire economy. Hopefully, something left over on top of that as well for the entrepreneurs in the form of a profit.
Yep.
Now, heterogeneity of capital, we've already discussed. That's just the idea that capital goods aren't equally suited for all uses, so we need to fit them together in very specific ways in order to make them work correctly. Right? And again, this is all ultimately going to be determined by consumers, not really by the physical characteristics of the goods. The physical characteristics do often play a role because they are often related to our ability to satisfy consumers. Once again, using that dishwasher server example, it's unlikely that consumers would value, the server made out of an industrial dishwasher the way that they'd value the services of a server that it was made in a more conventional way, right? So I hope I haven't stretched that analogy too far. But the whole point is that ultimately consumers are driving the value formation process here as well, right? Because it always comes back to what consumers think. Right? So entrepreneurs are always in this process. It's a never-ending process of combining and recombining capital goods, heterogeneous capital goods, goods that aren't equally serviceable in all uses. And this, in a sense, is the entrepreneurial problem, because this has to be done in the face of uncertainty. Right? And it requires constant trial and error. It requires constantly learning from experience. And this is one of the crucial aspects of understanding what it is that entrepreneurs do in practice, is that they move through this persistent process of applying resources in the marketplace and seeing ultimately what consumers want, and then ultimately what the value of those resources is going to be. Right? So in this sense, there's not really a correct combination of resources that entrepreneurs are ever really aiming for. There's no abstract, correct idea of the perfect economy. because we can't know this, right? Even if there were such a thing, we would never be able to tell what it would be. So the best we can do is sort of go through the process in real time as entrepreneurs try and figure it out as they go. So entrepreneurs are only ever really correct in a kind of momentary sense in which consumers at the present time show that entrepreneurs' past judgments were good enough to earn them some kind of a profit.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4, the letter B, POD, and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
Yeah, and that idea of the dynamism, Matt, of the combinations, I think, is one of our great insights. You can never get the right combination. It's always changing. I was thinking of this the other day when I was listening to somebody talking about the Fortune 500 in the year 2000, I think it was, and he talked about Time Warner, AOL, and other firms like that they were dominant at the time, but they couldn't keep the combination of assets just right, and the market passed them by. They couldn't keep up. So there's never a right combination. Is that correct? It's always changing.
That's right. I mean, again, we can say in a moment to moment kind of way that entrepreneurs must have done something right in the past because consumers in the present value what they have to offer and therefore sort of reward them, if you will, with their hard-earned money, which becomes the entrepreneur's profit. So in that limited sense, we can say that entrepreneurs were correct. But the crucial point is that there isn't some grand abstract idea out there, or at least not one that makes any sense, about what the perfect distribution, the perfect combination of resources would look like. And the reason that there is no such ideal is because the information that would be required to make it is constantly changing, right? And that's even assuming that we could ever know all of that information to begin with, which of course we can't. So in that grander sense, in the sense of some kind of broader equilibrium, there really isn't any one that we could identify, at least not one that wouldn't just be totally arbitrary.
Yeah. Well, before we move on, I just want to put a highlight on that word that you used, imputation. And, I look at that and it's a brilliant tool that we have that's a little hard to describe. So I think of it as a phase change. So the scientists in complexity theory talk about a phase change. Water changes into ice. How the hell does that happen? Well, the molecules start to do something different because of outside effect. And imputation seems to me is we're taking subjective value. Value is a feeling. It's an experience in the mind of the consumer. And then the entrepreneur turns that into numbers. They capitalize that experience. So you're taking imagination, subjectivity, and turning it into numbers, but it's still an exercise of imagination. So just emphasize for us how we do that, how we turn subjectivity into numbers.
Well, the key here is to talk about money prices. And this is a crucial aspect of Austrian economics, and especially ideas like what Ludwig von Mises called economic calculation. Most people might know that term from from Mises's discussion and his critique of central planning. However, it's actually a positive aspect of Austrian economics as well. In other words, it's a description of how the market economy works. It's a description of how entrepreneurs do business. And so what entrepreneurs are doing in this process of economic calculation is exactly what you described. They're trying to estimate the future money prices of various consumer goods and factors of production in such a way to figure out whether, if they combine those factors now, those future prices will end up paying off for them. So it's all about the entrepreneur's subjective assessment of what's going to happen in the future and what consumer values are going to look like in the future, what the state of technology and et cetera is going to look like at some point in the let's call it the unforeseeable future. Okay? That is past the point where anybody would roughly predict the same sorts of things. So entrepreneurs are dealing with this incredibly difficult problem of trying to forecast and trying to deal with sometimes what we call Knightian uncertainty, after the economist Frank Knight. And this is the persistent entrepreneurial problem is exactly this: trying to deal with uncertainty and trying to figure out how exactly to translate consumer values into monetary values, right? And ultimately, it's about figuring out what consumers are going to be willing to pay and how much they're going to be willing to buy. So forecasting that fact, if you have money prices in place, because they have to exist, you need some kind of reasonably stable monetary unit in order to do this. But once that's in place, then entrepreneurs are able to at least to compete based on whose judgment is better at figuring out what consumers are going to want. And this is how they manage to do it, right? So as long as they have this tool of money prices available to them, they at least have the means to try and translate all of this into money terms. They might not necessarily be successful, and in fact, they aren't. We know that they fail all the time, but at least they have the most basic kind of institutional framework available to them to be able to do this. Whereas if you take away money prices, for example, if you have a situation of monetary collapse or something like this, then this crucial tool that entrepreneurs need becomes distorted or even valueless.
So, bearing in mind, Matt, that mental model, that entrepreneurial method, as we're calling it, imagining the uncertain future, that brings us to the concept of business strategy or corporate strategy or firm strategy as it's taught in business school and depicted in the business press, and we read about it in business books. It's a masterminded and centralized plan for the achievement of long-term goals. You expect it to come from the top of the hierarchy, the C-suite or the Office of Strategy or whatever it might be, and then it's given to the organization to follow. And Austrian strategy that we're talking about today with your books and your papers is a very different idea. So let's expound that. What's the Austrian strategy compared to that B school strategy?
Sure. So, for the sake of, let's call it nuance, it is worth pointing out that, management as a whole and strategic management as a field within it, they have evolved quite a bit over the past roughly 50 years or so. So there are a lot of different approaches. Typically, my view and those of other Austrians who work in these areas is that none of the existing schools of thought really gets it all right. There are many of them that have some good elements, but usually combined with some weak or bad elements as well. So it's our view that there's a distinct Austrian approach to this topic that does get everything right, or at least we hope so. So this is in contrast to some of the ideas that you mentioned, which are sometimes associated with what are called the design schools or the planning schools of management, or the design or planning schools of strategy. And these views tend to look at everything from a very top-down approach. This is the approach that I think most students learn, for instance, in their undergrad management courses. You'll usually learn some variations and some alternatives as well, but at the core of what you learn in a lot of management are going to be these very traditional models, Porter's 5 forces model of competition, SWOT analysis to look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that a business faces. Pestel analysis to analyze the external business environment, and so on. So these are very commonly used tools, but they share in common the idea that all you really need to do to craft a successful business strategy is plug in all the right information to these models and see what kind of answers they spit out for you. And then you follow the advice of the model, and somehow that produces a successful business strategy and a successful enterprise, right? So of course, probably unsurprisingly, Austrians tend to be a bit critical of this. And you can look at this across a number of different sort of margins or topics. But a few that are worth mentioning are first, a conflict of thinking versus learning. So a lot of the traditional business school strategy models will focus on thinking rather than learning. In other words, they'll look at strategy as something that we sit down and plan out. For instance, in Porter's and SWOT and Pestel and these models that I just mentioned, strategy is something that we just need the CEO sits in his or her office, plans everything out, plugs in the data, comes up with the strategy, and then announces it to everybody else in the business organization. They follow the orders, and somehow success comes from that. Again, obviously, I'm exaggerating a little bit to make the point,
Not much.
but the crucial issue is that so much of conventional strategy looks at strategy making as something that we very rationally determine, as opposed to something that we learn by doing, something that we learn by getting out there, putting, say, a product into the marketplace and learning what consumers have to say about it, and so on. So, in a way, this top-down version of strategy almost it doesn't disregard consumers altogether, but it really does kind of assign them a kind of secondary role. Right? So this is one really important distinction between the way Austrians often look at strategy and the way that more conventional management scholars do. Another one that's worth bringing up is the idea of formulation of a strategy versus the implementation of strategy. And again, this is in a way a contrast between thinking and doing, but it's really about the issue of uncertainty once more, because the top-down planning design style of strategy tends to assume that you can know in advance what your valuable resources are going to be, right? And that you can in some way rationally calculate what the best way to combine them is going to be in order to produce a profitable business, right? But of course, uncertainty exists, and we don't know these things. We don't know in advance. Even if we have incredibly valuable, complex emerging technologies that we have in house, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be valuable for consumers, right? They have to be able to produce useful goods and services for consumers to use in order for those resources to obtain a market value and for them to be considered a real strength or a really valuable resource for our business. Otherwise, it's just wasted research and development. And of course, we see this problem happening all the time, including in a lot of emerging tech businesses who spend lots and lots of money developing new resources, new technologies, and without really knowing in advance whether or not they're going to be useful for anything. So once more, just I think a good way to highlight that principle is the idea that the technological advancement of a particular resource doesn't really tell us anything about whether it's going to produce something that consumers are actually going to like and that's going to make the firm profitable. Right? So here's another contrast, this emphasis on uncertainty that the Austrians employ, which very often isn't in the mainstream views of strategy because they look at things like resources as being something that you can define objectively in the present rather than something that's very dynamic and subject to change. A third margin across which you can compare the two sort of broad perspectives is the idea of concentration versus dispersion of decision making within the firm. So once again, in the conventional view, you have one CEO or maybe a small planning group who sit at the top of the organization and they just fire off memos and instructions to everybody else down in the hierarchy. Right? But of course, this is not just unrealistic, it's very often dangerous in terms of the health of the business overall, because any organization is going to have even a firm with just a few people in it is going to have some degree of tacit knowledge or of local knowledge, particular bits of knowledge and information that different people in the firm have that can't easily and costlessly be communicated to people up at the top of the hierarchy, right? So the CEO or the planning, the board or whomever, they're not going to know this information, and they're not going to be able to use it to plan an effective business strategy if they're just making decisions from the top down all the time. So Austrians, in contrast to this extreme view, would emphasize the dispersion of decision-making authority throughout the firm, and they would emphasize how important it is to have lots of people making decisions. And especially, for instance, if you have managers who are lower down in the hierarchy of the business, allowing them the ability to make decisions on the spot, instead of just constantly forcing them to abide by some set of rules that the CEO has come up with and applies in a one-size-fits-all kind of fashion. It seems a lot more sensible to give people on the ground a lot more control over what they do, and especially over very practical, minute-to-minute, everyday kinds of decisions. Because, of course, especially in large firms, these kind of decisions happen all the time, and you don't have the time or the ability to even let the CEO know that a decision needs to be made, let alone actually get a good decision back from him. Right? So once more, and this is a much bigger topic, really, than I'm giving it credit for, this idea of dispersed decision making within firms. But I hope I've just managed to paint maybe a little picture of what it's about. And then finally, on top of that, I'll mention also the idea of the structure of the business versus the strategy of the business. And in a way, this is a kind of chicken and egg problem. Which comes first? Do you organize the business? Do you structure it and then determine your strategy? Or do you first strategize and then, based on your strategy, figure out how you're going to organize your business? Right? And this is a very tricky one because, in a sense, it's both, right? Both your strategy and your structure are going to influence each other to some extent. But the main point here is that a lot of mainstream strategy literature will treat strategy as prior. They'll say, again, they take this sort of top-down view, and they say, look, the CEO can just plan it out, figure out what the best strategy is, and then based on the strategy, we'll organize the business in such a way that the CEO's vision will come to fruition. Right? But of course, this isn't a very realistic way of looking at things, because we can't just start new business organizations from scratch every time a new CEO with a new vision happens to come along. Right? We have existing businesses that are structured in certain ways, and it costs time and resources and money, of course, to adjust those things. So it's very costly to change a business organization. And as a result of that, our strategies are going to have to adjust to some extent to businesses as they currently exist, because we can't just instantly and costlessly change them to fit, the strategy of the week that the CEO happened to come up with. So these, I think, are four useful ways in which to compare sort of an Austrian approach to strategy to a more mainstream approach. And as you can see, they involve a number of different issues regarding how businesses are organized, and especially this central theme of who exactly is planning strategy, if anyone. How does that process take place within a business? And then as a result of the strategy, how does the organization change, or does it change as a result of a changing and evolving strategy?
Well, thank you, Matt, for that exposition. For people listening, we'll capture those four contrasts that Matt walked us through in a downloadable tool for this week, and the implications of them, but it's certainly profound. And you're right, maybe we should have another conversation about dispersion and organization. But I wanted to go to another element in one of your papers. And if you think about how strategy emerges and what management can do or what structure can do. And you think of strategy as an emergent property as opposed to a top-down plan property. And you introduce the idea of rules, which requires some exposition, I think, because that sounds kind of rigid, but that's not how you're using it. You say rules are an organizational framework. And I'm just going to refer to a quote, and maybe you can explain this, Matt. Inside the organization, rules are a substitute for the price system that you talked about that gives signals to the entrepreneur outside the firm on how to allocate resources and how to coordinate. And you have a quote from Hayek that says that this substitute, this internal device that we're using in the firm, must convey to the individuals, the people working in the firm, the knowledge they need to enable them to fit their plans, what they do every day, into those of others in the firm, so that you make the most use of the firm's resources that you possibly can. I'm sure that's not a very good way of saying it all, but tell us about rules and what we mean by rules and how a company develops its rules.
Of course. So if, as I was just saying, we can take a sort of Austrian approach to strategy that's a little more dispersed, it's less beholden to very formal rules. And, if we're not interested in this top-down planning where everybody's constantly told exactly what they need to be doing and when and where and how and why and so on. If we don't take that approach and we want to emphasize a more emergent, maybe evolutionary, if you will, approach to making strategy for businesses, then what exactly does that look like, right? Because obviously it's not very helpful to just say, well, just let the strategy emerge, right? You want to you need to have some degree of structure. You need to have some type of guidance for people in terms of what they do in their day-to-day jobs within a business firm. It's not going to be completely chaotic. So rules are one possible solution to this problem. One very practical way of allowing for these emergent processes to take place within business and allow us to form business strategies that are useful in the marketplace and that really help us to capture all of this tacit and dispersed knowledge that goes on within the firm. Now, you mentioned the contrast between sort of the system of market prices outside the firm and then what goes on inside the firm. This is another insight of the Austrians, the idea that, in particular, outside the firm, we have this massive array of market prices that help entrepreneurs guide their decisions, right? Prices help entrepreneurs, they're a crucial tool, as I mentioned before, to help entrepreneurs figure out what prices might look like in the future and therefore how to construct their organizations. But inside the firm, you don't have exchanges being made, right? And as a result, there are no prices within the firm, and this crucial system of guidance doesn't exist inside the firm in the same way. So you need something else to replace it, right? So once again, we end up at the need for some kind of way to structure everybody's behavior inside the firm. And so we suggest that simple rules are a good way to do this. The idea here is that instead of planning everything from the top down, what CEOs can do is they can learn by doing, right? Again, emphasizing the learning, to try and figure out basic rules that they can communicate to different managers or employees throughout the business hierarchy that'll allow them to make their own decisions on the spot in a more helpful way. Right. So just to give you one example of this, maybe we say that a business establishes a simple rule such that whenever supply chains are threatened, when there's uncertainty in the supply chain, when a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal, for example, we adopt as a simple rule the idea of repurposing resources. In other words, old, disused resources old capital goods that are maybe in disrepair and that normally wouldn't be great resources to use. They might be too expensive, for instance. Those can be repurposed and brought back into production as a relatively low-cost way of dealing with supply chain problems, because we can't get the resources that we need new, so we're going to repurpose some old ones. Right? So this is an example of just a very broad, simple kind of rule that you can employ within the firm that gives advice to managers about how they can deal with very specific situations. Right? Again, I used a very general scenario when a supply chain is threatened. And then, of course, in practice, this always turns out to be something like a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal, or businesses being closed because of lockdowns through the pandemic, or something like this. But the point is that in these specific scenarios that most people couldn't have really predicted, people have something, a rule, which serves as a framework for them to actually make decisions on the spot. In other words, the decision making still gets done, but it gets done without a CEO needing to plan it, needing to tell everybody involved in the business what they need to do. But it also, because it's being made by managers and people who are closer to the action, people who are really on the ground, it allows them to use their personal knowledge, their tacit knowledge, or the sort of local knowledge of people around them in a most productive way, in order to figure out exactly how to carry out that rule. Right? So in this sense, it's a way of kind of getting the best of both worlds. You retain a certain amount of structure within your organization, but also you allow for an emergent strategy process. You allow yourself to learn by doing. You allow yourself to be dynamic and flexible and adaptable to change, and to make the best use of everybody who's involved in your organization and all of the knowledge that they possess.
Yeah, our friend Bob Luddy, the CEO of Captive Air, talked on the podcast one time about having a rule for his company, which was always have the best price in the marketplace. That's a pretty simple rule, but it requires tremendous knowledge, obviously, at the local level about what prices are. It's got to apply to complete systems as well as component parts. It's got to apply to acts of service. It's got to apply to turnaround times, because that's another kind of a price that you might have. And so that, I think, is a good example of a simple rule that people can follow in a very distinctive way. And in fact, that brings us to another point, Matt, which is we Austrians don't believe much in competitive advantage, because that's a kind of closed structure idea of the firm and the market. Is not very dynamic. But these sets of rules, as they evolve, can become very distinctive and, in fact, unique to an individual firm. So is it the rules that bring us the uniqueness of each individual firm?
Yes, they are one source of uniqueness. And in a way, we could say competitive advantage, but as you point out, there are various problems with that expression. But one way to look at it is just to realize that every business is going to be different in a sense, right? And every entrepreneur is different in a sense. So even if you have the same formal rules, the same sort of words written down on paper in different companies, in practice, that can mean very different things. Right. For example, to use the case I mentioned before, if our rule is that when supply chains are threatened, we repurpose resources, that's going to mean drastically different things for peach producers in Greece versus lawnmower manufacturers in the US, right? So it's the same rule, but depending on what business is, what the entrepreneur is like, and how and all of the different knowledge and challenges associated with each business, that same rule is going to have drastically different implications for how things are done, and for the way that rules evolve within those organizations, and for the way that those businesses are ultimately able to compete and hopefully earn a profit.
So that brings us, Matt, I think, to a concluding point, or at least an end point for today, at least, where people say, well, what's the replacement for strategy? If we can't have the top-down strategy that's traditional, what is the replacement? And your expression in one of your papers is explore and exploit. Now, I happen to prefer the term explore and expand, because the word exploit can be misinterpreted sometimes. But the point is that that's the logical outcome of Austrian economics understanding of the firm and following all of our principles, that strategy is exploration and then expanding on or exploiting, to use that term, what works and doing less of what doesn't work. So just let's finish on having you expound on explore and exploit.
Yes, so I actually agree with you that explore or expand may be the more uh, felicitous
Yeah, we'll
expression,
adopt that.
because what they really emphasize is that there is a constant process of trial and error in the marketplace. It is not the case that we can just sit down and rationally plan and figure all of this out and figure out what we need to do, and then we just go out there and do it. It is not the case that having, say, an MBA level education is enough to put you in the driver's seat of a successful firm and give you all the tools you need to plan a successful strategy, right? Of course not. And when you explain it like that, it's very obvious and intuitive. But of course, when you sort of bury it underneath a mountain of management concepts and different models of competition and planning and so forth, it becomes a lot more difficult to see that really basic truth that the future is always uncertain. We never really know what's going to be happening. So we have to use our good judgment as entrepreneurs to try and figure all of that out. Right. And that's what the strategy process is, because ultimately strategy is entrepreneurial, just like all of the other, in a sense, decision making that goes on within a business. There is a heavily entrepreneurial element in strategy, this need to go through trial and error, to explore, right? And sometimes when you explore, you discover things you really wish you hadn't, right? Sometimes you make mistakes. But of course, this is all a part of the process. And it's through that trial and error that eventually sustainable long-term strategies evolve, right? And those include things like very simple rules that companies can use, and that, of course, they can change over time to adapt to changing circumstances, to generate profit and to generate, a sort of more sustainable business, financially speaking.
Yeah, and there's explore and exploit, or explore and expand, is not just a strategy concept, it's also a trade-off, right? How much resources do you allocate to exploring, and then how much to expanding? And when do you know that that expansion has run into diminishing returns, so you need to do some more exploration? You're constantly working that trade-off, yeah?
Yes, exactly. And once more, this is just a crucial part of what entrepreneurs do, is try and navigate all of these trade-offs, because ultimately it's the entrepreneurs who are going to succeed or fail. It's the entrepreneurs who are either going to profit or loss based on their ability to successfully navigate this incredibly complex labyrinth of trade-offs. So yes, I think that's absolutely a crucial part of this entire process.
Good. Well, for today, we're going to wrap up there, Matt, for time. So I think we've concluded through a logical process what the Austrian way of thinking about strategy is and how firms can apply that. We didn't get time to talk about the implication for organization design, which you mentioned briefly, so we might do that another time. But next week, you're going to come back and talk about the principles that underpin this idea of Austrian strategy, so that we can help our listeners to absorb the principles as well as the practical application. So thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you very much again, and I look forward to our continued discussion.
Good. Thanks, Matt.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.